Welcome back to The Move, where I've been through the book 10 minutes at a time. I'm your host, Justin Koo, and in today's episode, we're talking about that one time in the Bible that a woman stole some idols from her father while menstruating. If you're wondering, what in the world are we talking about? We're looking at Genesis chapter 31, verses 22 to 55. You know, when I think of these titles, I think of them, and I'm like, I feel like that's a really strong way to say it, but then I ask myself the question, is that true or is it not? And it is true. This is what the story is saying, and it's a very weird story.
Yeah, it's funny, man. It's like biblical clickbait. It's like the Bible itself is like, you should check out this story about a woman who stole some idols while menstruating.
It's just wild. Yeah. And what I noticed in this passage is that seems that there's a lot of kind of unanswered threads of the story. Like, why are these details here? Like the concept of the whole menstruating idea, as well as the idea of her stealing the idols. It doesn't really seem like those two have any conclusion or any transparent purpose. It's just like these are weird details that are just included just for the fun of it.
The menstruating part, I can't say that I've thought too deeply about. The idol part is very interesting to me because she steals the idol from her father.
Right.
And that would have been, think about it, it would have been the inheritance of the older.
Okay. I didn't think about it that way.
Because she has a sister.
Okay.
Rachel and
so
Leah.
Then she would have. So if we're thinking about idols, we're thinking about statues that are likely made out of a precious material of some sort. So there's a monetary value to it.
Well, not so much the monetary value, but that they represent something about God.
Like a supposed blessing.
There you go.
Okay. So I'm already thinking, because you were giving us this kind of a nod of the head to in our previous episodes, that there's going to be reoccurring themes, and I'm seeing the Jacob and Esau one. Is this the illusion that there's the younger one who steals the blessing of God from the older one? Like, is this kind of what we're seeing here?
I mean, I don't know. Is that something you're seeing?
That's what I'm seeing. I'm just curious. Is it a mirage? Am I seeing rightly, or what's going on?
Yeah, you have these two siblings. One of them takes this thing that represents something about the deity's presence, blessing. Like, they're the ones. The one who has the idols is the one who mediates the presence of God. They're the familial priest.
Wow.
It usually goes to the older. The younger takes it. And so you have.
It's interesting because I read a blog right before we were on this. I was like, okay, what's the story with the idols? And there were, I guess, two generally competed theories. One is no, there's an actual blessing that's associated with these idols, or at least a perceived blessing with these idols, right?
Yeah.
And in stealing the idols, she's trying to steal the blessing for herself. The second theory was much more noble. It was, no, she's a true believer, and she recognizes that her father is worshiping false idols, and so she steals the idols in an attempt to stop him from acting foolishly. And maybe the hope is that he'll somehow recognize the one true God by no longer having idols present.
Yeah, one of those is really, really Christian, and then the other one seems to be in the context of the story. I'll let you figure out.
Well, the blogger's conclusion was the very Christian one. It's like, I like to believe that it's a very nice thing that she was attempting to doing, but seeing how it's a repeat of the previous narrative, it's like, okay, that's probably not what was
it's just
going on.
Listen, assume that by the time you're in Genesis 31, there's only 31 chapters to the story thus far.
Right.
So if there's only 31 chapters to the story thus far, assume that the context is the 30 chapters that have come before it.
So it can't be, it's probably less likely that it's directly pointing to something in the future.
Here's what's
that's there.
Let me say something offensive and that you'll have to deal with in the comments. Okay. This story is not Christian.
Yeah.
Right?
If it's Christian, it's just as much Christian as it is Muslim, or right? And all the other religions that tend to use the Abrahamic texts.
Yeah. This story is certainly pointing to something that then gives way for a group of people to subsequently and in time be actually called Christians. And then those Christians read the text and then find that the one that they worship is hidden within the story. Like, for instance, you say, Jonathan, where's he hidden within the story?
That was my next question.
Right? Yeah. All right. Look at verse 22.
3 days later. Oh, I just hear the number 3. And when I'm thinking Christologically, is that the right?
That's right. Christologically.
Okay. There's always something with 3. There's always something with 7, it seems like, right? Okay, so 3 days later, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. He ran away. It seems like the figure who's the intermediary is missing for 3 days.
think about, who is Jacob?
Jacob is the
Like, what is Jacob's steward? What does he carry?
He's got the promise.
He's got the promise.
Yeah.
The promise of what?
The promise of the one who's going to accomplish reconciliation.
Yeah, and if we fast forward, right, we know that he stewards the promise that was given to his father about life coming from death. That's the promise, that life will come from death. You will be a blessing to many nations. You will have progeny. You will have property, right? You'll have, but it's all based around life coming from death through this son named Isaac.
And when you say life through death, you're talking about an individual whose members seem to be dead, an old man who's incapable of producing life. This is the life through death. Because I was actually thinking, like, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's one, right?
Okay.
That's one, that Abraham is to the point of death. So is Sarah, her womb is dried up, and yet life comes from these things that are dead. Right? Additionally, finally, in Genesis 22, when Abraham goes up the hill, he says, me and the boy will return, because he was confident that God would bring life even in the midst of death.
Yeah.
So now Jacob is he is the embodiment. He is the one that stewards this promise. Guess who does not steward the promise? Laban. Laban actually is a figure that has a lot of mixed motives and seems to be motivated by material first.
He just wants to be attached to the promise. He doesn't necessarily care for the greater picture of what the promise accomplished. He just wants to be paid.
Right.
And we see that in the way that he interacts with the sheep and the speckled and the striped sheep or whatever it was.
Who does that remind you of thus far in the story?
Nearly every character that we've come across.
Right. Esau. Right.
Yeah.
Every character, Esau reminds you of Esau. You know who else he reminds you of? He reminds you of Lot.
He wanted the best land out of the two. Like he saw, oh, that one's got a lot of bounty. I'm gonna go live in Sodom because it's got a lot of promise.
And then when you just think about this way, like this narrative thinking, all of a sudden Jacob, the one with the promise, flees from the one who has been working according to material, position, title, money, the features of what the promise can bring, but not rooted in the giver of the promise, who is right. And so when you think about this, you begin to see that there's two ways here. There is the way of life according to the promise, and then there is the way of seeking after the benefits of the promise at the expense of the giver of the promise, so that you're working towards something. I don't know if I were writing it later, I probably wouldn't, I'm not that smart or inspired, but if somebody were to write it later, there is one person, Jacob, who's working according to a gift he has received. And then there is another one who's working according to wages and work and benefits, right?
Okay.
But we know that the wages of the work that these guys are actually working, Esau, and even when Abraham works with Hagar and Laban works to get his better position, all of those works are paid out ultimately in a end. There is nothing there. Like there is no life if you follow this trajectory of wages, right? So I don't know, poetically, you might be able to say that the wages actually end up paying in death. But if you actually live according to the gift that you've received, there actually is, in fact, life, right? You could say, maybe, right? And so that if even just simply looking at verse 22, you have, after 3 days, the one who had the promise that was part of a system that may or may not, and it does, lead to death. After 3 days, he flees and he's actually separated and foreign now. A break has happened.
Wow.
Does that at all?
No, Jonathan, it's just completely blank.
Completely blank, right? This is why then Jesus on the road to Emmaus begins from Genesis and all through Moses, shows them every single story was ultimately about Him.
Yeah, I love this. Jesus gives us the cheat code. We were talking in our previous plug at the end of our last episode how you got the cheat sheet. Jesus already done give us the cheat sheet.
Yeah.
He said, search the scriptures because that's where you think you get an eternal life. But it's about me.
It's about me.
The narrative is about me. I'm in every story. And it's interesting. You quote the Emmaus story because I think when a lot of times we want to learn about Jesus, it's like rightfully so, we go to John, we go to Mark, we go to Matthew or Luke, right? We go to one of the four gospels. And yet when Jesus wants to tell his story, he starts in Genesis.
That's right. The revelation that he gives of himself after being resurrected, he starts at the beginning.
Wow.
Right? And this is part and parcel of it. So after 3 days, he fled. He took his kinsmen with him, pursued him for 7 days. So it's like this intense, perfect pursuit, right? And follows closely after him. And then verse 24, which is so fascinating, which again embodies Pharaoh and Abimelech, right? Where be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. So now God is appearing to the one who might threaten the one who holds the promise. Is like, hey man, pause.
Yeah.
Mind your steps, right? Where
mind
before
your business. Mind your business.
Yeah, right. He did this with Pharaoh. He did this with Abimelech. So all of these stories are coming to bear yet again. You see what I'm saying? And and again, verse 25, all of these stories, because we're heading into a transition phase, right?
Okay.
Especially for Genesis. And y'all discuss that in the next following chapters. But it's a transition phase of Jacob having been with Laban to now Jacob actually coming to the end of one part of his life and then crossing over the river Jabbok. And anyway, that's ahead.
Okay.
But you see in verse 25, Laban overtook Jacob. Jacob had pitched his tents in the hill country. Laban and his kinsmen pitched his tents in the hill country of Gilead. So you have these pitched tents that are contrasting with one another, and now you have them coming together. Again, this should bring up images of like Genesis 17, I think Genesis 18, of Abraham and Laban.
Right.
So it's all of these themes just coming together. These characters are re-embodying, they're re-performing the stories of their forefathers. And now, and we probably don't have enough time to get into everything, but isn't it fascinating that Laban's posture towards Jacob is that which Jacob has is still his?
Yeah, I was noticing this, like the narrative, and it was mentioned in the previous episode that 10 times, and I don't know if that's figuratively or if that's like an actual number or there's a symbolic, 10 times he changes his wages. And at least from the way that the picture is painted is that Laban is consistently taking advantage of. And
constantly tricking and deceiving Jacob, whose name is Deceiver.
Right, which is, there's that. And then at the end of it though, Laban's all like trying to be all goody-goody with he's still trying to, even though he's got this in the background, he's still trying to make another deal. He's like, oh yeah, promise me we'll set up these rocks over here. It'll be really cool. Like we'll be buddies. We'll be business partners.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Even that again, strategic. The strategic, right? Even you're talking about like from verse
towards the end of our chapter.
Towards the end, yeah. If you actually get to verse 42, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, right? Jacob says, there's a recognition of Laban, you've been a trickster, you've been a huckster, you've been trying to use strategery against me. And the reason I know is because real recognize real, right? Like Jacob's like, I'm a deceiver too. I know what you're up to, right? But then he concludes with this. He's like, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, right? Surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed.
Real quick, and this maybe isn't the point that you're leading to, but I think it's really interesting how now Jacob has that confidence that God is on my side. Yeah. Whereas, however many chapters ago, he's running away looking for his life. He's just like, what in the world is going on? Now he's like, hey, listen, I got the goods.
Yeah, and it's God who gave me this wealth, not you. Right?
Wow, there's some character development here.
Yeah, it's God. The point is God gave me this,
and it's interesting that Jacob's not the one who stole the idols here.
Yeah.
Oh, Jacob's not. He's not grasping for the promise because he has believed for 20 years that the promise is his. He's seeing the manifestation of it in the way that God has blessed through these visions of how these sheep are repopulating, whatever the case is. He's like, yeah, God's on my side. God is blessing. He is faithful. I don't need to reach out and grasp anymore.
100%. So what you're seeing here is the development of the faith of Jacob according to the promise that he actually stewards, that he can rest in it.
Wow.
And so he's coming to that point of decision of actually being fully at rest in God, right? In the same way that his grandfather had to get there by Genesis 22.
Can you remember what it was like having that kind of transition moment where you're like, oh shoot, like I do believe, like you had this moment, I'm sure years in the past where you're grasping strategery, you're doing all that you can to outmaneuver, to position yourself for favor. But then I'm guessing there was probably at least one of several moments where you're like, I don't got to do that. Like I can just chill and I can just be.
Yeah. I do. I remember that. It was when I woke up one day and I knew God loved me. And I was at rest. It's great.
Would recommend 10 out of 10?
Recommend, yeah. I would recommend it 10 out of 9 times. Right? But the thing, sorry, because I'm a little in my mind right now, I'm still thinking, look at the way Laban responds to Jacob's development. At the end of verse 22, when he says, God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. Think about that. This dude has a word of knowledge. Jacob actually has insight of what God said to Laban the night before. And he's like, don't try to play me. Like, I got the revelation of what's really going on, and God rebuked you.
And yet he still makes the deal.
And he still goes. Look at verse 43. Then Laban answered and said to him, the daughters are my daughters. The children are my children. The flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day for these my daughters, or for they are my children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant.
He's doing a lot of posturing. Because if you're the guy who holds all the cards, why do you need the covenant to begin with?
Yeah, man. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
So yeah, you have this. And again, I mean, we're jumping back and forth in the narrative, but you have Rachel, who again is kind of reperforming what has come before in the text. You have Laban, who is pursuing, trying to get what's his, what he thinks is his, right? And he's reperforming the very thing that Jacob did at the beginning, where he stole, the embodiment of what Esau sought after but couldn't get. Laban is embodying the sort of avarice, maybe, or preferential self-preference of Lot, when he's like, yeah, I'll take the good side. Like, Laban is this, and the only thing that remains constant, pure, and with integrity is the faithfulness of a God who, again, will see his plan to fruition.
Yeah.
Right?
The promises are showing fruit. His word's not returning void. He's accomplishing exactly that which he said he would do.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that he's accomplishing it by those who steward his promise actually being broken according to the integrity of said promise. Like, Jacob has this huge character development, not because the promise somehow shifted and changed, but precisely because the promise was so unchangeable and it manifested, and the promise was willing to wait out his own stubbornness and deception until it finally rested in the abundance that the promise actually has innate within it. Does that make sense? That it was Jacob who had to change. God did not change. The promise did not change. Jacob had to change in relationship to the promise, and in relationship that he didn't have to pursue like Laban pursued. He didn't have to seek the better piece of land like Lot sought the better piece of land. He didn't have to deceive his parents like Rachel has just deceived, and how he had deceived in the past. He could have rested and waited on the way the Lord worked on his behalf the night previous in rebuking Laban. He could have rested in that same way. And that's what comes across to me in this piece of the narrative yet again, is the integrity, the faithfulness, the promise, and how that promise actually goes with us into our wilderness, right? Like, the promise didn't lead him into the wilderness. It went with him. Like, God went with him while Jacob sojourned, and it was faithful to him while he was being manipulated, marginalized, taken advantage of, right? While he was taking advantage, while he was seeking to do his strategery, the promise did not change, right? And then that faithfulness, that promise, and as Jacob surrendered his life to it, it brought him back home, right? Although Jacob left and the promise was with him, it was the faithfulness of the promise that led him to return.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you see this all at play, and we could spend a long time talking about these 30-something verses. We don't have time, but
Unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes.
right? And we've doubled that. But yeah, man, it's just yet again and again, the foibles, the failures, the buffoonery, the strategizing, the futility of the human to try to attain and gain something while God is just literally freely giving it, right? So there's a song that comes to mind every once in a while, and particularly now with what I want to highlight. You want to know how this song goes, Justin?
I would love it.
Goes like this. You are such a nerd. Oh, you are a nerd. You are such a nerd. Right?
I'm going to clip that and use that as the ringtone for when you call me now.
That's funny because that song is self-referential. It's about me. And one of the nerdy things I like to do, as you know, is do theology and read some books. And there's one book that has recently blown my mind. And by recent, I mean in the recent last couple of years. But it is this book, The Emergence of Sin by Matthew Crossman, I think is how you pronounce it, or Crossman is how you pronounce it. He is a scholar and director of the Life Worth Living program at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. And he's also a lecturer of divinity and humanities at Yale. Dude is a brain on legs and does a fascinating study on the cosmic tyrant that is sin in the book of Romans, because sin is not just merely the acts that we commit. It seems to be that sin, the way Paul presents it, is a tyrant that is social, cosmic, and, or there was one more, personal, right? So there's these levels of like the personal, social, and the cosmic, right? And this guy just does an amazing reading, and he goes into things like emergent properties and emergent theory, which is when entities are actually some sort of organism. When so think about a beehive, right? A beehive seems to be a living organism made of living independent organisms. So you have a bee, then when all the bees get together, they actually seem to be a collective conscience that is an organism that works independent, that is an organism when all the bees get together. That's an emergent property, right? So he talks about sin in light of these things, and it is fascinating. It's super nerdy. It's super dense. You might need a thesaurus. I have, and I do use one. But listen, anything worth doing,
Yeah, do it right.
and it isn't easy.
Yeah.
So if you really want to get into some good stuff, I highly recommend this book. You know, I don't co-sign 100% of everything, but be thoughtful, expand your brains.
Expand the brain. I remember when I first was hearing the ideas of like sin has been defeated, sin is in the grave, like these ideas. And when my understanding of what sin was actions or inactions, it was very confusing for me to understand, like, what does that mean? Like, okay, like I read it, I hear it, and it's clearly there, but I have no concept of how that actually applies to my life. And I think when I started to realize maybe a better definition for sin according to scripture, this idea of sin being
a cosmic tyrant,
right? This idea that that's the thing that's been defeated, that's the thing that we are free from,
cosmic, social, and personal.
Things start to click a little bit better.
Yeah, man. So get yourself a good book if you want. Go ahead and nerd out, and then we can all sing the song together. We are such nerds. Yes, we all are nerds. Yes, I am a nerd. You can also be a nerd.
You know, if you are only listening to the audio version of this show, you're driving in your car, you're working out, you're running errands right now, do me a favor. Go watch the YouTube clip, because there's a moment where Jonathan is doing the whole finger guns, and he's singing,
finger dancing,
and
pew, pew.
It's worth a view.
We are such nerds. Yes, we all are nerds. Yes, I am a nerd. You can also be a nerd.